All right, so today we're going to look at UVs and texturing for these three models that we've looked at for Lab 3 in class. So we have the board, the apple, and the nail. Each one of these is going to require or give us the ability to use a different set of operations for projecting UVs and building a nice UV set out of these three. We're also going to concentrate on organizing these three different sets of UVs into one overall texture. That way we only have to load one texture for color, one file for specularity, and one file for bump in order to properly texture all three items. And therefore keep the loading to a minimum and the processing of files to a minimum. So, first thing we need to look at is what are UVs. So if I come in, I'm in the modeling mode. If I come into my UV and UV editor, it's going to open up this window right here. Now this window is my UV editor window. As you can see, it's 4 grids. If I select an object, we can see the UV layout, the default UV layout of this object over here in the top right. Now this top right area is where all of our UVs eventually are going to need to be laid out into before we make a UV snapshot, which is a picture of these UVs, and then build that into a texture, which we'll get to that. Alright, so we have a few different modes, sub-object modes inside of UVs. We have UV and shell, which are the new ones. We have face, vertex, and edge, which we've had before in standard modeling. Alright, UVs generally are kind of a relative of the vertex. They are not vertices, but they're similar to vertices, and they generally occupy the same space. The shell is a group of faces and edges and UVs. So that'll be more apparent once we start making new projections of shells. Alright. In order to make solid projections, we need to make those in face mode. So we first need to come in and select all the faces that we're going to want. I don't want the entire top of this guy. I can select them over here, or I can select them on my object. And if you notice over here, as I hover over, it shows exactly which face I'm hovering on at the time. Alright, so I'm just going to make a really quick selection. I'm going to double click this guy and then pop out to my side view, and I'm going to deselect everything that's not on the top. You do that by holding down Control if you're on a Mac. Let me try that again. Here we go. Deselect all that, and deselect all those, and deselect those guys. Alright. Pop back over here, check my selection, make sure I'm happy with it. And I am. Now, as we looked at class, or discussed in class, there are several ways to go about the UV projections inside of this. I'm going to get rid of my outliner for right now so I have more space. We looked at doing a split right down the center and then just splaying those two pieces out as a top half and a bottom half. But as you remember, we ended up with an interesting seam right across through here. It was less than desirable. We also looked at doing a similar thing and then laying those over top of each other. Again, we still had the seam, but it was more mirrored. Then we looked at splitting it in half, creating a top half and then mirroring it, which also gave us a funky seam. Now what we're going to do today is we're going to do it the third way that we looked at, or the fourth way that we looked at, which was to break this thing down into individual sides, individual shells, and then each of those shells gets stitched back together over here in our UV editor. Alright, so how do we make a shell? I select these faces, the faces I want to be part of my first shell, and then I'm going to do this from a top view for this particular angle because I want it to be orthoscopic, as we discussed in class. And I'm going to come up into UVs, and I'm going to come down to camera based. When I select that, camera based is going to give me a brand new shell. I'm going to pull this guy over to the side, but it's going to try and scale it to the entire size of this box, which is not what I want, because right now these are going to be really stretched out. So I'm going to scale this in so that it looks like it meets the general proportions of its real world counterpart. Alright, so I've got that guy. I'm going to move him over a little bit and shrink him down just a touch to make sure he still fits inside of one of these boxes. Now I'm moving him off to the left just as a working area. When I finish this up, in order to take a UV snapshot, everything that I drag over in here eventually is going to end up stacked up over on this right side in this gray box, like a really nice game of Tetris. Alright, so I have this real world camera based projection, but I can pretty well bet, because of this angle, and I know these edges are on a slight angle, that there's going to be a little bit of squash in the texture right here. So I'm going to come into UV mode. I'm going to zoom in here, and I'm going to end up selecting all of these UVs. I'm going to leave the middle ones alone because those ones are already fine. So I'm just holding down Shift plus Control, which is add to selection, and I'm just going to keep grabbing all of these edge UVs. Now what we're going to do is we're going to come up into our tools and go to our unfold tool. Alright, now you can also find it right here, unfold UV tool. Select that guy, and that's going to give me this red circle whenever I'm hovering over actual UVs. Right now I've got a pretty large circle, so that's the brush size. So I can hold down B and then left click and drag to my left and shrink the size of my brush, or drag to my right and grow the size of my brush. Alright, so I'm going to shrink this down so I'm only affecting the area I want, and then I'm going to paint right over top of these UVs. And as I do, you can see that they move around a little bit. Alright. And now, if you look at this and compare it over here, the shape of this looks even more like the shape that we initially started with, right? Alright. From here, we're going to go ahead and we're going to review this same process across the other 5 sides. Go back into face mode, pop back in the object, and we're going to go ahead and finish up the rest of these sides real fast. So I'm going to double click this guy, and I'm going to come back into my side view here, or my front, and I'm going to wipe out some of these. Hold down Control and just get rid of these guys here. Check my selection. Looks like I've got an extra one. Now for some reason I actually had an extra face selected, or I missed a face. You can always reproject your selection or reproject your UVs. That's not a problem. It'll move things to a new shell or give you a new shell. Alright, so I'll pop back out here. Now I know that my faces are on the bottom, but I'm still going to go ahead and use my UV camera based. Click that. Over here we can see that I now have this second shell. I'm going to do the same process. I'm going to shrink that down just a little bit and shrink them down just a little bit overall so that those UVs look nice. Now, because this is the bottom, if we look at this guy, we can see basically lines up the same shape, same layout as the top. Now that's not really what we're going to want. We actually need to flip this guy. So this shell here, I'll go to shell mode. Now you can see what shell mode does. Grabs an entire block of faces. I'm going to come up here in the top into my dock, and I'm going to flip this on the U like so, which is going to give me an invert, which now shows me the tops of these instead of the bottom, or the, I'm sorry, the inside of the back faces of that particular area. So it's a pretty quick fix. Alright, come back in. I can go ahead and grab these faces directly out of here. Let's see, where's that located? Right there. And I'm going to go ahead. I can shoot that from the side or just go ahead and shoot it straight from here with my camera base because I'm lined up on it pretty well. I'll just do like so. Shrink that down and pull that over here. Alright, now I have the other three sides that I need to still do. I'm going to get this so that I'm just kind of methodically going through and getting all the same faces. Holding down shift, double click, shift. I'm not letting go of shift. I'm clicking and then double clicking the one below it so that I get a line of faces. Alright, you can see where those exist over here in the UV editor. Got this in my front view, lined up real nice. UV, camera based. There we go. Shrink that guy down again. And just drag that over here real fast. I'll size up all these things a little better in a bit. Alright. Eventually these are going to end up being roughly the same size as these tops and bottoms. You can go ahead and do that now. What you want is for your UV space to be equal throughout. And once we re-stitch all these together, it'll make more sense. Alright, so now we have the other two sides of faces already split up over here, so we don't have to do any sort of fancy selection techniques. All I need to do is come over here and see where I am on my side. Come into face, select those faces over here in my shell, in my UV editor, and UVs, camera based, bam, there we go. shrink that guy down a little bit and bring it over here. That's going to have to get rotated as well. Probably fit on this side, I think. Scale it down just a wee bit. And we'll do the same thing over here. And grab those. And I'm just going to go ahead and hit camera base from here. I'm already in there. I know I'm going to have to flip this, but I'll get to that here in a second. So I'll show you why we have to flip that. Your translate, rotate, and scale all work off the exact same buttons, as well as select, which is Q. So Q, W, E, and R are your hotkeys inside of here. If you need to move or drag around, you're still going to be holding down Command and middle mouse click and drag to navigate inside of your UV editor. Alright, so for this method, the next step is going to be to start arranging these guys just a little bit and make all of this one flat set of UVs. Alright, so we can come in. First, we probably need to go ahead and make sure that the edges on this guy are good. Real fast like we did over here, which generally speaking there's very little distortion, but for the sake of this demo we'll do it. Alright, so that's better. Now we're going to come in, I'm going to hit Q to exit out of that tool, and I'm going to right click, go to edge mode. Now here's an interesting note. When I hover over an edge, I can see which edge correlates. So the edge of this shell here correlates directly to the edge of this shell over here, because on the model it's the same edge. You can have multiple or a singular edge of the model which is represented in multiple places, which is why inside of your shell here we don't want to start moving around edges. What we want to move is shells and UVs, right? On a model we want to move vertices, faces, and edges. In UVs, or in the UV editor, we only move, generally speaking, the UVs and the shells. Alright, the nice thing about this is it allows me to look and see which edges should match up. Alright, so I'm going to come into my shell, I'm going to grab this guy, and I'm going to scoot him real nice and close here. Alright, now if I'm really wanting to be nitpicky, I want to get these edges kind of lined up. When I sew these together, and I'll show you now, when I sew these two edges together, it's going to take and stretch these edges to the middle of these two. So if I've spent all this time laying out my UVs in order to make sure that they have a real world scale and size, I don't want to do anything in order to stretch these back out in a fashion that's going to ruin that work. Alright, but to show you, first off, I need to save. Well, yeah. Let's see, underscore. Done. Alright. It's important to note that when you're dealing with UVs, for some reason it's kind of a fickle process and you can crash your computer pretty easy. So save early and often. So when I come back into my edge mode, I can see exactly which edges are lined up. Now, I'm going to come up here into my tools, and I have Sew UV tool. I'll select that. And again, it's going to give me a brush. That's harder to see, but I can lower this guy down. When I'm holding down B and left drag, it shrinks it, right drag grows it. It's only going to stitch together sides that can be stitched together. So I'm going to grab this tool, I'm going to come in here, hover over the sides that need to be stitched, and then pull. Now you can see how that's stretching that side way out, right? I don't want that. What I should be doing, or should be considering doing, is coming into my shell mode, grab this guy, I'm going to move him real close, and then go into UV mode, and grab these individual bands of UVs, and start to move them to more closely mimic the contours of the board as they exist. Alright. This will ensure that there's less warpage, so I go back to my edge mode, back to my sew tool, and now we can stitch those edges together and we haven't deformed anything. Alright. So I'm going to hit Q again to cancel out of that mode. Come back into shell mode. Now I continue to match these shells up. Right? Alright. So if I come into edge mode, I can start looking at this and see that, okay, this edge matches up here. This edge matches up here. Now how do I get this edge to match to this and this edge to match to that? Well, we'd already done it with this particular shell. I need to come into my shell mode. It's because this was the other side of this side, right? So I'm going to grab that shell, I'm going to flip it in the U, right here. There we go. Now you can see how it changed my contour. So I take this guy, I can either take it and attach it right here, or I can take it and bring it inside of here. It really depends on however I'm feeling. So I come into my edge mode again, and I take a look and see where it lines up. Alright, so I'm going to come into my shell and just move it over to here somewhere. Alright, let's just attach it to this one and we'll attach this to here. That will work just fine. Alright, I'm going to scale it up to get things a little closer to what I'm looking for. Line this guy up, go to UV mode real fast, and start moving these UVs in to avoid distortion. Edge mode, sew tool, and just paint right down that edge. Alright. Continuing on, hit Q to cancel that tool, grab my shell, W to translate, pull this guy over here. I can also drag him over to this side if I really want to. Doesn't really much matter. Grab this, I'm just going to pull that close. Grab these guys, pull them down right into there. Alright. sew tool, and I just trace right down that line. Alright, from here we need to look at these two sides. We can attach them to this guy or this guy. Really doesn't matter. Usually I pick one of the other and I just attach both of them to an opposing end. Q to exit out of that tool. Edge mode actually, so we can see where things line up. Looks like this one lines up down here in the bottom. And this one lines up here at the top, but this face probably needs to be flipped to hit this. Okay. Now, depending on how we want to lay this out, we can lay it out to where both of these are on top here, top and bottom, or we can lay it out, if we want to conserve a little bit more space, we can lay out to where both of these are here and here respectively, or on top and on bottom. I'm sorry, here and here, both on top or both on bottom. And that will allow us a little bit more space to deal with, right? Because we don't have both of these two thicknesses, one on top and one on bottom, which would give us less textile space. We have both on top together or both on bottom together, which then saves us however much space this is in thickness and allows us to get a little bit more room out of our texture. So I think that's what we're actually going to do. So let's grab the shell. Just kind of start spacing these guys out. I'm just going to check my edges again to see where he pops in. This guy on the bottom there, bottom there. You might not be able to do that as easily as I thought. Okay, looks like we're going to have to make these one top and one bottom. Just depends on which side they want to snap to. That's fine. Okay, so let me grab this shell. Just going to pull him down here. I'll get him lined up here in a second. And this guy will pull right over to here. See, okay, he's going to be there. So this guy's going to need to be flipped. So I'm going to go this shell. This one I'm going to flip on the V right here, like so. That way when I go back to edge mode, I can see that these two line up. Oh, this one also needs to be flipped in the U. Shell, select, back to edge. Okay, we're good, we're good. Nice. Now this one lines up nicely. Okay, good. So now we can come in here. I'm using my middle mouse wheel to scroll on in. Come in, grab my shell, and I'm just going to pull him down relatively close, like so. Scale it in a bit. Alright, and then start grabbing these UVs and moving them in just a little bit closer so that things snap without a whole lot of distortion, as we talked earlier. Grab my sew tool and click and drag. Oops. Just grab that one and that one. Alright. That'll get that corner real nice. And then we can come down here to the bottom, hit my Q, exit out of that tool, shell, click on this, move it over a little bit right here. It's pretty close. I can definitely make my edits with my UVs. Grab these guys, pull that in, grab them, here, here, no, be fine right there. Sew tool. Now you can see I'm grabbing a lot of stuff here, which means my brush is too big. I'm working on these tight details. I want to shrink that brush size down. Again, that's hold down B left click and drag while you're holding B to increase or decrease that brush size. I'm going to decrease it a little bit. There we go, just so I can hit smaller areas and just drag along that seam. Alright, so now we've got this shell sewn up real nice. Hit Q, exit out of that. Now depending on how crazy you want to get about these, because we know this board, the wood grain is going to kind of follow the twists of this board along through here. We can straighten some of this out. We can leave it organic like that, which is fine. But the image we're going to drop in would then have to be, in some cases, many cases, straightened in order to then torque around with the board, or the image is going to have to be stretched back and forth to mimic those warps. So what we can do actually is come in here and we can start straightening out edges like so. We can do it manually, undo that, or we can come in and grab the individual UVs. Now it's pretty easy in this case to come in, double click a set of edges and straighten those out. We can also grab UVs and come in and highlight this string of UVs like so. Make sure you have them all. And then we can come up here and do our align. And do my align minimum U or maximum U. In this case, whatever direction I'm starting, that's the direction I'm going to keep on going. That way everything lines up real nice. And that lines it up like so. Alright, so I can come in here and continue this process. Now typically you wouldn't start from the inside of the model, right? Typically you would start from the outside. If I'm going to line everything up like that, I would do it from one side of the model. So I'm going to come in like so. And hit that. And then I can come in here and start grabbing this line. Just holding down Shift, click that guy, and I'll go through my model exactly like this. I'm not really going to worry about doing it so much with this area, but I'm definitely going to try and square up all the vertical edges in this particular case. Alright. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. Now, as long as I haven't used any other operations, I can use the G button or the G key to use my last command. That way I can kind of fly through these. Keep smacking these all together real quick. Get that one. Some of these edges get a little tricky, so you have to be pretty precise. Alright, that one. You can see kind of the process I'm going through here. It's not the most enjoyable process. It's a bit monotonous, but this attention to detail will help separate low-level textures from high-level textures pretty easily, especially on things like wood grain where you expect the wood grain to kind of warp throughout. If I was doing a hand-painted texture, this wouldn't matter at all because I would just paint the textures to meet the flow of the UVs. So in many senses, the way that you lay out UVs is somewhat dependent upon the style of art that you're going for, the style of texture that you're going for. If you're making things photorealistic, I find it's more often than not better to take the time and square things up a little bit more. But if you're making things hand painted with a more organic feel in that sense, because you can paint to the UV layout just as easily, it doesn't really matter so much. At that point, what's most important is having a clean layout purely for the sake of, or mostly, I'm going to go ahead and get these ones squared up just a wee bit as well. It's not going to make a huge difference. Now the top I'm going to leave alone. I think, yeah, that way we don't end up with too much strange warping. And if I don't like the results, then I'll change the results of this a little bit afterwards. Alright, so I'm going to shrink this down to make sure, oops, I'm going to deselect that, shell mode. I'm going to shrink this down just a little bit so it all fits inside of this box right here, and generally we're pretty good. That'll give me a good basis to work on and start adding textures to here in a second. So I'm going to keep this guy over here for now. That way when I start popping in my new textures, if I have more than one item selected, I can start arranging those differently. Well, actually, heck with it. I'm just going to go ahead and stick this over here for now. So I want this guy inside of this gray area. What we're going to do is position the eventual UVs or the UV layouts of all three of these objects inside of here in order to give each one kind of a realistic or as close to realistic comparison in texture relation. Now, granted, the board is clearly going to be far larger than the apple and way larger than the nail, but we can fit the nail probably into an area about this big, maybe smaller, and then give ourselves just a little bit more room on the wood and then use the rest of this for the apple. The apple probably is going to be a pretty good showpiece. You might zoom in on that. If you want a little bit more detail on that guy, we'll give him a little bit more room. Alright, so we're going to call this guy done for now on the wood. Now we're going to come in and use a few new techniques on the apple and on the nail. We'll start with the nail first because that's the easiest of the bunch. Now you can see, again, I'm hovering over it. I'm still in shell mode, and it's currently all one giant shell. Alright, this is the original layout. I built this using a cube, and that's generally the default cube setting. Alright, from here, what we need to do is look at the overall shape of this and try to figure out how can we best utilize our UV tools up here to mimic the general shape of this object, or take advantage of this object. Alright, so I'm going to come into face mode. If I look up here, I realize I have cylindrical. We're going to go ahead and use that. First we need to go ahead and select our faces. So I'm going to come in here. I'm going to ignore the head of the nail for now. I'm just going to go ahead and get the base of this nail. Alright. So I have everything selected in face mode. And I'm going to come into UVs, cylindrical. Now, I think we talked about this earlier, but you always want to make sure in the beginning that you come in and make sure Create New UV Set is turned off. You don't want that on for most of these UV layouts. In more advanced situations, you'll use this and items can have multiple UV sets, but in this particular case, in most cases, you'll want that turned off for what, especially for what we're doing. Alright, just going to go ahead and close that. Come in, cylindrical. Now, this is going to give us a whole new interface. You can see, if I grab this and pull it over, this is the result of what it's given us by default. Alright, this is a pretty ugly UV layout, right? We have the point kicking off in two different directions, which means we're going to have a weird seam coming down through here as well as here, and it didn't grab these lines of faces, so we're going to have a seam that comes up and over and up and over and up, which we definitely don't want. But that's an easy thing to prevent. The other issue is spread this thing across 2 and 2+ boxes wide, which we don't want. So we need to figure out how to deal with that. Alright, those are both easy solutions. So we can expand this thing in the U, make it fit inside of this box by grabbing hold of these red handles right here on the side and pulling them around, which you can see here, change the shape and shrunk it down. Now, its V location, we don't have to worry about too terrible much because that'll fit right in here, and it's only occupying the real world area from top to bottom of this object. Now, the next thing we can do in order to manipulate this and get a better read is rotate it. Now, how we're going to do that? If we come down to this red cross right down here at the very base, and we just left click him once, we look up here, and now we have a universal manipulator. Now I can expand out, translate, or scale from here, but I'm not interested in those. What I need to do in order to fix this situation is left click that ring one time, which is going to give me my rotation. I'm going to look at this and decide, okay, I think I need to rotate on my Y. And as I do, pay attention to the UV editor, and you can see already my shape is changing for the better. As I rotate around, slowly but surely, those UVs are starting to straighten themselves out into something that seems a little bit more acceptable. Go a little bit further around, and there we go. Now we're good to go. Alright, so this is something we can work with. So I'm going to hit Q to X out of that, and now I've got my bottom. Now, from here, if I think about which areas of this I'm going to see the most and how I want to see that, or these areas of the head of the nail, I generally know that I'm going to see this outside edge and the top of the nail most. So I'm going to go ahead and grab those faces. Just marquee select across them. And there we go. I'm just going to pop into my top view, hit F to zoom in on that guy, or focus, which is what it actually stands for, onto that. Come back into UV, and I'm going to use camera base. This one, if you pay any attention, is one of my most liked UV projection tools. So grab this, and I'm just going to pull them up real quick. Now this is actually a really good opportunity to get an idea of how this tool can mess with you and how UVs are a 2D representation of a 3D space. Now we can tell, looking at this nail head, if we look at the geometry from the top, this looks exactly the same here as this projection, right? Problem is, we have a side, which, as we can see, as I hover over the side over here, this side is just a slight line. It's because my UVs here are stacked under the UVs here, right? So, in order to fix that, we need to come back in to our unfold tool. So right click, UVs. I'm just going to hit Q to pop into select only so I don't have that manipulator in the way. I'm just going to come around and grab all of these edge UVs to help remove the distortion. Just hold down Shift and I'm going to come around and marquee select those. Come back up here into my dock, right here, and select my unfold tool. And I'm going to hold down B and make my brush just a little bit bigger so that I can deal with these guys. I probably want to go ahead and save at this point, just to make sure. Alright, so I'm going to come in here, and as I hover over, you can see that my side is now popping out and giving me something that's a little closer to a real-world representation of the scale of those faces, just spread out in 2D opposed to the 3D representation here. Alright, now if we look over here in our UV editor, hit the Q button, takes out that tool. We have just a handful of faces left. I'm going to right click, I'm going to come to faces, I'm just going to highlight those. That way we know we've got everything that remains. Alright, we can see what these are looking like. Now, what I'm going to want to do actually is ensure that there's not a real heavy-duty seam coming around this area, right? So in order to prevent that, because I know I'm not really going to see this area too terrible much, I'm going to go ahead and shoot this from the top again with my UV camera based, and it's going to give me this brand new shape over here. I'm going to move this over and line it up pretty much with my top. I'm going to come in to this area, I'm going to hit my F, and I'm going to scale this up so that it's basically the same size. And then we're going to grab the UVs and line them up right on top of the top here. That's going to ensure that whatever texture we lay here is going to hit this edge. Come into my perspective view. Whatever texture we get will hit this edge on the top and then invert itself to mirror itself underneath, which will look pretty seamless, especially considering we're not going to be looking at the underside of the nail very often, if ever. I'm going to come into UVs, and I'm going to grab these individual UVs and move them to line them up. Now if you hold down V, you can snap it directly to the underlying UVs. Just like snapping the vertices. Alright. We don't really have to worry about any of these internal ones. Only thing we're trying to do is make sure that everything is seamless on the outside here. And we'll go back to shell mode. Alright. So from here, I need to grab this shell and grab this guy as well and start scaling these things down considerably so that they'll fit over into a small area inside of this. Now if I really want to see, once I have these over here, where they're going to fit into the grand scheme of things, if I want all these put together, just hit F to focus in on this area. Actually, focus in on the selection. I'm going to come back in and go to object mode here in my world. I'm going to select this object and my nail, so my board and my nail. With both of those selected in object mode in my viewport, I can now come into here and go to shell and grab these two guys. Well, three technically, because there's top, bottom, and the bottom of the nail. And I can scale these together, rotate them if I need to as a pair, and drag these up here so they don't occupy a whole lot of space. I want to keep these pretty much inside this area. I can also give this guy a little bit more room to work with. Something along these lines. Scale that out a little bit more. I'm just going to use all of this area for the apple, so I can kind of give myself a little bit more real estate to work with. Pretty high res nail, which is what everybody needs in their life. High res nail textures. Alright, there we go. So I'm going to stick those two there, and then I'm going to keep this open for my apple skin textures. Actually, I'm going to shrink this down just a wee bit. There we go. Alright, so now we're going to do the apple. Come in here. Now we already have this kind of janky looking apple. It's like that because I messed with it in order to be able to tell whether or not you guys did the work. So we have this apple. We're going to use, because it's mostly a sphere, we're going to use the spherical layout. I'm going to come back into face mode or spherical projection. I'm going to select everything, but I'm going to deselect my stem. Just holding down Shift. You can also hold down Control, which is remove selection, and get rid of those. Alright, so we have the body of the apple, the actual fruit area. And I'm going to come it into UVs and spherical. From here we can see that it gives us this massive selection and does something funky down here in the bottom. We're going to end up taking care of that the same way that we did the other sphere, or the cylinder. So whenever we see these odd offsets, we know that we have to do something inside of here. And because this is so large, we're going to have to deal with the U and the V in order to stretch it down into this box. So first we're going to start off like we did before with this red manipulator right here in the middle and stretch it around the U. Then I'm going to grab my green handle right here, which is going to squish this down here in the V. So bring that right in, and now it fits in real nice. Now I'm going to grab this guy and just move him over so I can see better how this layout is going to happen. What I want is for this to all shift directly underneath the correlating line of faces. Alright, so I'm going to come down here and look for that red handle. We got it right here on the bottom. Also have it over here, but I'm going to click it right there, and that's going to give us this new manipulator, this circle. So I'm going to click that circle just once with a left click, and from here I'm going to start to rotate with this green circle. It's rotating on the Y axis, which is going to manipulate this set of UVs. Slowly spinning it over until it's almost there. One more. Bam. There we go. Looks pretty good. So this is the base of the apple, or the fruit of the apple. Hit my Q, go back into shell mode, select it, and I'm going to scale this guy down just a little bit so I can put it right over here. The next part that we need is the stem, which we can stick right here, or because we already have wood, we can stick it right over here, just however we want to do this. I think I'm going to stick it up above here so we can get a slightly different stem texture. Alright, so for the stem texture, what we're going to use, well, first we're going to need to go to our vertice mode, and because this is kind of rounded out, there's a few ways we could do this. We could come in and maybe grab this chain right here, like so. Come to my face mode. So we could grab this chain and do a cylinder of that, and maybe a cylinder of that, and then a cylinder of this, and then come in and grab these faces and do a camera-based selection on those, and we wouldn't have to model anything. We can just stitch those back together. Or we can quickly come in to our edge mode, double click these edge loops, and do some quick alterations to the model to line this guy up just a little bit better. Pull that up a bit to maintain that rotation and that length of the stem. Oops. Gotta grab the vertices there and move those. I'll pull those up just a little bit. That'll work a lot better. And grab this, put it back in the center-ish. There we go. Alright, so this will give me a lot more easy to read results, simple results. I'm going to grab all these guys. I don't really need to worry about the top. I'm going to get him in just a second. And we're going to go ahead and go into UV, cylindrical. I'll select it. And because we did a pretty good job, actually it gives us a really good read on those faces without any issue. Only thing we're going to do is spin this guy around and squish them down like so. And we're good to go. Go into my scale and scale that down accordingly. And drag it over. And we're pretty much there. Let me squeeze that down just a bit so it fits into this little area, which I know is basically where it's going to need to live. And then this guy's eventually going to turn into a circle. So all thing I'm going to do is I'm going to hold down Shift and I'll just go to face mode and I'll select the remaining faces, which is going to give me the top of this stem. I'll come into my top mode one more time, hit F. Here we are. UV, camera based, there we go. Gives me this ginormous circle, which I know I don't need to be anywhere near that big, because in the real world it's pretty tiny. So we'll make it about that size. That'll work. That keeps these edges about the same width as the edges in the stem right here. All right. So everything's laid out. Right click, go to object mode. I can highlight all of my objects, and then when I come in here into my UV editor, I can see exactly how much space these are taking up in the real world. Now, the other thing this is going to allow me to do, come into my shell, I'm going to move this over just a touch. There we go. I just want a little bit more buffer in between these two textures just so they don't go bumping into each other. This one, move over from the edge a little bit. I always like to give myself just a little bit of room around the edge. Alright, as well as a bit of a buffer in between each of these shells. Alright, so this is looking pretty good. We've got our stem top, we've got our apple, we've got our nail and nail top, and our entire board. With all these selected in object mode, have to be in object mode, we're going to come up into polygons, click on that menu. This is inside of your UV editor. Come all the way down to the bottom, UV snapshot. We're going to click on that, and it's going to open up this window right here. Now, clearly I was doing 4K textures last time I used this. We're not going to need anything anywhere near that size. I'm going to browse real fast, and it's going to tell me or ask me where I want to dump this thing. Because this file is going to be a temporary file, it's only going to work or be useful as essentially a blueprint for where my textures are going to be needed inside of this space. I'm just going to drop it on the desktop. So I'm going to call this, let's see, board nail apple underscore UV, just so I have a name that I know what it is. I'm going to hit save, and you can see right here in file name, it tells me exactly where this is going to go and the name that you've given it. Now, because we have keep aspect ratio on, I can come in here and I'm going to make a 1024, which will be perfectly fine. And as soon as I hit tab, it knocks them both down. PNG works just fine. Color white also works just fine. I'm going to hit OK. And then right down here, at the bottom of my screen we can see saved file, user, desktop, and the name of the file. Alright. Then if we come out to our desktop, you'll see that that file exists. From here, we would go into Photoshop, which I'll do in the next video, and create the actual textures, the color texture, the bump map, and our specularity map, and then come back in and apply those to the models inside of Maya.